Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to this event. I'm Eric Dawson, the manager of the McClung Historical Collection, and we like to partner with our friends here at the East Tennessee Historical Society to put on different talks and events here in the auditorium. And we're really glad to have Reed Massengill with us here today. I want to tell you about a few events coming up, though. On October 9th, it's going to be at 5:30, not the noon brown bag, but a 5:30 evening program. Shannon Hitchcock and Jim Stokely will be here to talk about children's book author Shannon Hitchcock's and Jim Stokely's Wilma Dykeman legacy. So they're involved with the Wilma Dykeman Foundation and will be here to talk about her and the children's book involved with that. And then coming up on October 11th, that's Friday, again at 5 p.m. start time. It's going to go till 8 p.m. We're going to have Football Friday. That's where we set up in the back of at the back of the museum here, and we're going to have food trucks, live bands. We're going to be showing films, old football films from the Tennessee Archive of Moving Image and Sound. UT Vol is going back to the 1920s up through the 60s and 70s. So come on out and enjoy that event. And then Monsters at the Museum, we're getting into spooky season. So October 26th, here we're going to have a lot of fun kids activities and things to do with Halloween themed and history. So come out to that. But today our guest, as I said, is Reed Massengill, and you're here, I'm sure you know the book, Medgar Evers, Byron de la Beckwith and Me, Why Portrait of a Racist Remains Relevant in the 21st Century. You might have read the book. It came out originally in 1994. This is the third edition. And in addition to working on this book over the years, Reed has also been working on a book about Greta Garbo and Clarence Brown, famous Knoxville native Clarence Brown. And we look forward to that being published sometime in the near future. And he's revisited this book a few times. And he's going to come up today and talk a little bit about why that might be. So, Reed Massengill.
Thank you. I'm setting a timer. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is how a 20th century presentation was done. First of all, thank you for coming. And I want to thank Lisa Oakley from the East Tennessee Historical Society and Eric Dawson from the McClung Historical Collection and the Knox County Public Libraries. And Tim Yates, who I've never met, is Tim here or out there, who orders the books for the gift shop. And I wanted to thank him. So somebody passed the word. They've ordered copies of Portrait of a Racist for the gift shop. That makes me very happy. And Walt Evans from UT Press is here. I have a long relationship with UT. I was a 1984 journalism graduate, grew up here, went to school here, got the hell out of here, eventually came back here. I also have a relationship with the Knox County Public Libraries that goes back to the research era when I was working on this book, and with the East Tennessee History Center and the Tennessee Archive of Moving Image and Sound, which are housing one of the rare Clarence Brown's films that I own. Hey, Carol. In any event, thank you for coming. Fall is in the air. And what are your three favorite coffee ordering words at Starbucks when fall comes? Pumpkin spice latte, 3 words. It's time for people to revisit the movie Hocus Pocus. Who remembers the Sanderson sisters? How many of them were there? 3. It's also time to get out your box set of DVDs of the TV series Charmed about the sisters who were witches. How many of them were there? 3. And what were their names? Anybody? Prue, Piper, and Phoebe. Great. I'm not going to stretch your question answering skills much beyond that, except to say, who here is of my generation and can remember Schoolhouse Rock on Saturday mornings? Yes. Okay, so 3 is a magic number. And in my comments today, you will see that I return time and time again to the number 3 because it has actually had quite some impact on Portrait of a Racist over the years. Why are we here today? I'm not asking that as an existential question. I'm asking, why are we here 61 years after Medgar Evers was assassinated in his driveway, 60 years after 2 trials ended in hung juries for his assassin, who was my uncle, married to my mom's oldest sister. And why are we here talking about Medgar Evers long after he died in his driveway, basically in Jackson, Mississippi? That's the reason we're here today. Many of you will remember, a few of you may remember from your lifetime, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy. I was 2 years old. I don't remember that. Martin Luther King, I have a vague recollection of that in 1968. Bobby Kennedy, also 1968. Those 3 assassinations are the ones that we think about most often when we think about that turbulent period in the civil rights movement, when our country was divided and fraught and angry. But there were 2 other people who were assassinated in those years. Medgar Evers was actually the first victim to fall to a political assassination on a very hot June night in 1963. And Malcolm X was shot in the February of 1965. And those are 2 that we don't talk about as much. They haven't gotten as much attention. We don't have a national holiday for Medgar Evers. He's never been on a stamp. He is, in some people's minds, not what you think of when you think of the 1960s civil rights movement, but he should be. And the only visual aid that I brought today, which I'm going to pass around, we live today in a time of school shootings and thoughts and prayers. And I won't say that we have become accustomed to it, but we seem increasingly less surprised when these things happen. In 1963, when Medgar Evers was shot, it was such an unusual event. And it was so shocking at the time, this is 5 months before President Kennedy was assassinated, that it made the cover of Life magazine when his funeral was held at Arlington. So pass this around. It's not a particularly well-known cover of Life. Movie stars are better known. But it's worth mentioning today because he is the reason that we are here talking about my 3rd edition of a book that came out 30 years ago. That's 3rd edition, 30 years ago. My belief is that today Medgar Evers would be both humbled by the fact that President Biden just a few months ago awarded him posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he would be either horrified or bitterly disappointed at the state of our nation in terms of race relations, the ongoing efforts to diminish Black and brown people's voting ability. There are a lot of things going on today that I think would make Medgar Evers bitterly disappointed. Both Medgar Evers and Byron DeLay Beckwith, and I say Byron DeLay Beckwith because during his lifetime, no one ever explained to him that the actual pronunciation of his name was Byron de la Beckwith. He was called DeLay growing up. His son was Little DeLay. His father was called DeLay. That was his name. So when you hear me say Byron DeLay Beckwith, I'm not mispronouncing it. That's the way he pronounced his name. He and Medgar Evers had 3 things in common that you would not expect an assassin and the victim of an assassination to have in common. They both were very strong believers in their development as sons of Mississippi. They were very enamored of their home state. And in Beckwith's case, he wanted to maintain the status quo when integration efforts began and segregation began to crumble. And just as fiercely, Medgar Evers wanted to lead the fight to change segregation enlist Black people to be able to vote, and increase their economic empowerment through education, voting rights, and civic participation. They also both served during World War II. Medgar Evers was involved in the landing at Normandy and was part of an Army segregated transportation corps. Beckwith was a Marine who was wounded in the Battle of Tarawa. Both of them came back home with some medals, and both of them came back home with a burning desire to, on Beckwith's part, retain white supremacy in the state of Mississippi, and on Evers' part, to rattle that cage and shake the foundations of segregation. The third thing they have in common is that they were both married to strong women who were initially reluctant to support their activities. Now, in Myrlie Evers' case, and some of you who's seen Myrlie Evers on TV during the years that she was head of the NAACP, or last year when she was being interviewed in the Evers home on the anniversary of the assassination, she would tell you, and in a book that she published not long after Medgar's death, she wrote about her reluctance and hesitation in his putting himself out there in the civil rights movement in the late 50s and the early 60s. She knew he was putting a target on his own back. They had how many children? Three. And she wanted those children to grow up with a father. So she was a reluctant participant early on in Medgar's efforts in Mississippi. But when it was clear to her in the first few years of their marriage that he was not going to diminish his appetite to change things, she joined forces with him. And in fact, when they opened the first NAACP office in Jackson, she worked unpaid as his secretary, and they had a strict rule in the office that she would address him as Mr. Evers, and he addressed her as Mrs. Evers, and they tried to conduct that work relationship as professionally as they could. On the Beckwith side of the equation, my Aunt Mary, who was a very strong woman and who was my mother's oldest sister, did not have any interest in supporting her husband's activities with the White Citizens Council, which was a very respectable organization in Mississippi in the late 50s and early 60s, led by businessmen and lawyers and judges and business owners to sanction the diminishment of rights of Black people through any means they could articulate, whether it was not sitting at a lunch counter with white people, or not sitting in a theater with white people, or not shopping in the better stores. The more aggressive and militant organization to which Beckwith belonged, which my aunt did not support, was the Ku Klux Klan. She never really embraced that white sheet wearing ideology, and she did not stand at the ironing board with a cigarette and press his sheets for him. But those were three things that Medgar Evers and Beckwith had in common, which make them cut in some ways from the same piece of cloth: where they were from, their experiences during war, the tenor of their marriages. My connection to this story is partly through my aunt and partly through my journalism background, but I owe my strong interest in this book to Byron DeLay Beckwith, who, through my cousin, his son, Little DeLay, found out after I graduated from UT with a journalism degree that there was now a writer in the family, and who, to my horror, wrote me at my home address in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1984, after I'd graduated and moved to Atlanta, a long friendly letter in his own fancy handwriting, addressing me as Dear Kinsman Numero Uno, I understand we have a writer in the family now, and I've been looking for somebody to write my life story. How about you? Creepy, crazy, unexpected, too good to be true? Hard to say. I had actually started a little thin manila file folder on Beckwith when I was 11 or 12 years old. There was at that time some news reporting in the Knoxville Journal and the Knoxville News Sentinel about his arrests in Louisiana, where he had been caught transporting explosives and firearms into Louisiana with a map to the home of a local B'nai B'rith Jewish leader's home, which he intended to bomb. And so he spent some time in the Pokey in Angola, Louisiana in the 70s. And as a kid, having seen his name in my grandmother's Bible and not knowing who this man was, because he and my aunt had been married and divorced 3 times, which I'll go into a little bit more, not a lot more. In any event, as a kid, interested in stuff like that, I was clipping out newspaper cuttings, pasting them onto a piece of typing paper, and keeping a little file folder, which was my beginning, my entry into this story. And those papers are now, with all my other research materials and videotaped interviews and oral histories, in the Special Collections Unit at UT Libraries. With Beckwith's introduction to me through his first letter, we began a decade-long correspondence that was as scary as it was interesting. He sent me cassette tapes of white supremacist church sermons from his Christian Identity Church. And if those of you who are here aren't familiar with Christian Identity, it's kind of akin to what today is Dominion theology, not what we call Christian nationalism or religious nationalism, but further to the right than that, if you can imagine a thing. A lot of racist literature, literature from the Klan, literature from Aryan nations. He'd been written up at that time as a hero to the white movement, and so anytime they praised him, he would Xerox a copy and send it to me. Klan paraphernalia, lots and lots and lots and lots of letters comprised of lots and lots and lots of pages, because when he sat down to write a letter, he did not jot off a quick note. Some of his letters were 6 pages, 8 pages, 10 pages. They are also now all in special collections at UT. Most importantly, after I had strung him along for a while saying, well, I'll do some research on my end, you send me stuff on your end, let's see whether I can decide whether I have any interest in doing this. I had petitioned the FBI for his FBI files through the Freedom of Information Act, and I was getting blockaded regularly. I was met with a lot of lack of cooperation. And I suspect now, in hindsight, that may be in part because efforts were underway to re-indict him for the Evers murder. Regardless, I mentioned my frustration with the FBI to Beckwith, who very graciously said, oh, I've got 30 pounds of FBI files. Here, I'll put them in a UPS box. Shipped them to me at 295 Park Avenue South in New York, where I was living at the time. And my Jewish roommate, Lauren Bank, when we unboxed them, was mortified that I was carrying on with a guy who was accused of a civil rights murder. But even more mortified, one Martin Luther King Day, when he called. Who remembers what a landline was? Called on our landline in our apartment, and I picked it up and told Lauren to get on the other line. Martin Luther King Day, which he referred to as Martin Lucifer Coon Day, and then sang a song called I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You. And I still have a living witness to that conversation because Lauren very clearly remembers the day she picked up the extension in her bedroom. Those FBI files were a treasure trove in a lot of ways, and I won't go off into that tributary except to say that between the time of the Evers murder in June of 1963 and the two trials in 1964, when Beckwith was accused of the murder and witnesses were paraded out, and two juries ended in hung juries, so there was no acquittal and there was no conviction. The FBI had continued to track Beckwith, his appearances at Klan rallies, his comments, his run for lieutenant governor of Mississippi in 1967, which failed pretty miserably. They had kept a close eye on him, and what I was able to pull from the files was an interesting opportunity. When in those days they would redact a piece of writing in an FBI file, they would mark it with a black marker. But if you took that to Kinko's and put it on the copier and let the light pass under it, you could sometimes read what they had redacted. So it led me to a number of things, and I began to get much more seriously interested in this story, and in particular in the two jury trials that had not resulted in an acquittal or a conviction. Because in 1964, all of his jurors in both trials were white Protestant men. There were no women on the jury. There were no black people on the jury. Medgar Evers had been fighting to get blacks registered to vote. They would have therefore been on the jury pool and potentially could have been included. But that was not the case in 1964. The effort to uncover new evidence began in earnest in the late 1980s when a reporter in Mississippi at the Jackson Clarion Ledger named Jerry Mitchell began to look into the files of a Mississippi agency called the Sovereignty Commission. Sovereignty Commission was a quasi-government agency that basically was put together informally to help keep the Negro in its place during the civil rights years. So you had informants to the Sovereignty Commission who were talking to its members to report on people's activities. But you also had in their notes evidence that there may have been jury tampering between Sovereignty Commission members and the first two juries in those 1964 trials. And when Jerry Mitchell began to investigate and write about this potential jury tampering on the part of the defense attorneys, it blew up. It was a very big story. And Myrlie Evers, who had long ago left Mississippi, remarried, had a life and a career in California for many years, she seized that day and that opportunity to meet with the district attorney in Jackson and say, this is a reason to reopen this case. And he said, well, be patient. She said, I've been patient for 27 years. He said, well, we're working on it. And they were working on it. In 1991, when I was 3 decades old, I turned 30 in that August, had a good job in New York, I was doing corporate editing, writing, speech writing, all kinds of fun stuff. Mississippi re-indicted him and brought Beckwith in for a grand jury examination and brought in the living witnesses who had testified in the 1964 trial, tried to dig up the police records from 1964, and guess what? The records had disappeared. There were no trial transcripts. The murder weapon was missing. It was like the evidence locker had been plundered. It's like a really good episode of Law and Order: Criminal Intent. Everything seemed to be missing. And to the credit of the district attorney in Mississippi at that time, They began to work to rebuild the case based on what they could cobble together and from the grand jury testimony of some of the witnesses who had testified in the first two trials. In a truly, truly weird twist of fate, the prosecutor from the district attorney's office, a guy named Bobby DeLauder, heard from his wife's family that her father, who had been a judge, had a trophy rifle in his collection that was related to one of the civil rights cases. And when he went and asked his mother-in-law if he could see the gun, guess what the serial number was? So the prosecutor in the new case found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's gun collection. Lots of weirdness going on at that time. I very rashly quit my job. And I went out in search of and got 3 things at a time when I had only written for magazines and corporate magazines and newsletters. I asked a powerful agent at William Morris for a 15-minute meeting, and I put my timer, which then was a wristwatch, on his desk, and I gave him the bullet point explanation of why I thought this deserved an agent, and I got an agent from William Morris. I made a 15-minute appointment with the executive literary editor at Vanity Fair, and I said, I will keep this to 15 minutes if you will listen to me. And I got an assignment from Vanity Fair. And with an agent and a Vanity Fair assignment, I went to publishers. And although we were rejected by, I think, 17 major publishers, one rejection letter stood out to me, and it was a guy named Bob Weil from St. Martin's Press, who had himself ridden a bus from New York to Mississippi to participate in Freedom Summer in 1964. And his rejection letter said, I remember very clearly what that time was like. This is a story that deserves to be told. Beckwith is a character we don't know much about, and you would be able to bring new information to the forefront, but you're not a published author. You have no track record with books. I can't sell this to my editorial board, and I'm sorry. So the third call I made was to Robert Weil, and I said, if you will give me 15 minutes. And so I put my watch on his desk, and at the end of 15 minutes, he said, let me take you to lunch. And we went down the street. He was at the Flatiron Building in New York. Who knows the Flatiron Building? St. Martin's offices were in the Flatiron Building at the time, and he said, let me take you to lunch. He took me to lunch, and I said to him, I understand your rejection. I understand the difficulty of trying to pitch a book by an unproven author. Would it help you to have a prologue and 2 or 3 chapters? And he said, yes. And so I pulled out of my briefcase a prologue and 2 chapters. And despite having an assignment from Vanity Fair and despite having an agent from William Morris, I sold my first book project, which was the first edition of Portrait of a Racist. I could not afford to continue to live in New York without a job. Fancy that, even in 1991. So I moved. My best friend at the time, who is still my best friend today, had been living above Bradley's store in Mechanicsville next to Fire Hall number 5. Just across the street from Thelma Bradley's house, Thelma ran the grill at the Bradley Market, where every morning she would make biscuits and eggs and bacon. Scott had a landline phone under his name, a KUB account under his name, and a lease with the Bradleys under his name. And I moved in and lived under his name and paid those bills for 3 years, during which I wrote the book. And during those 3 years when I was working on the book and living off the grid, Beckwith was fighting extradition from Signal Mountain, where he was living with his fourth wife, Thelma Neff Beckwith. There were rashes of motions to dismiss the case, initially based on a man's right to a speedy trial, which they struck down because new evidence had come to light. Beckwith forced his lawyers to file a motion to dismiss on the grounds of double jeopardy, but he'd never been convicted, and there's no statute of limitations on murder, so that didn't fly. Once he was extradited from Signal Mountain, he spent a while in the Chattanooga jail while they were awaiting extradition. But then there were jury selection delays because his friends throughout different counties of Mississippi, the Klansmen had partnered with Aryan nations, and Aryan nations skinhead foot soldiers were throwing racist tracts in the mailboxes and on the driveways of everybody who lived in the town where they were going to try to pull jurors from. So they relocated the trial twice and ultimately moved it back to Jackson, to Hinds County. For those 3 years that I was off the grid, I actually was on a Klan Aryan Nations hit list, which only became aware to me because Beckwith was still writing me at the time, and my letters were coming to a P.O. box at the old University Center at the University of Tennessee, where I would ride my bike from Mechanicsville over Grand Avenue and 16th Street to the University Center. And he sent me a postcard that had the names of 7 or 8 people who were on the current watch list, and right there I was. So my dad and mom had loaned me the use of a 1978 Toyota Celica. Remember, Dad, when the Toyota Celica had a windshield busted out? We think that may have been some hanky-panky on the part of people who were keeping an eye on me. And the FBI, when I was engaging with them locally, told me to go into news interviews and radio stations and TV stations wearing one shirt, coming out in a different shirt, wearing a baseball hat, taking off my glasses, having somebody pick me up, having somebody different drop me off. It was kind of crazy. But in 1994, Beckwith faced his third trial in Mississippi in the same courthouse of his 1964 trials, almost to the week, 3 decades after his first 2 trials. I mentioned before that the 2 trials in 64 had hung juries, white Protestant male jurors. The third trial did not have white Protestant male jurors. It had a very mixed, both racially and in every way, a mixed jury. Still living above the grocery store in Mechanicsville, I got a call from my literary agent on the West Coast telling me that I needed to go to Kinko's on Cumberland Avenue because the district attorney in Hinds County was going to subpoena me to testify in the trial, but they couldn't find me to serve me subpoena. And so they were going to fax it to Kinko's, and they wanted me standing at Kinko's when it came through. So I was subpoenaed by fax at Kinko's on Cumberland Avenue. They wanted several things from me. How many things did they want from me? 3. They wanted me to produce letters that Beckwith had written to the local Mississippi newspapers in the 1950s, which nobody had thought to go back and look for. And when the advance copy of my book hit the desk of the reviewer at the Clarion Ledger in Mississippi, these are uncorrected proofs, is what publishers send out for early reviews. The reviewer walked it over to Jerry Mitchell's desk, who'd been writing about Beckwith, writing about the Sovereignty Commission. And Jerry Mitchell took the book to the prosecutor and said, look at these letters Beckwith wrote in the 50s in which he said to the Greenwood Commonwealth, the NAACP is putting itself in a position to get exterminated. That was pretty fiery stuff for 1957-58, because the only person in Mississippi at that time who was the figurehead of the NAACP, of course, was Medgar Evers. The second thing that the prosecutor wanted me to produce was a letter Beckwith had written to my aunt. Now, my Aunt Mary was not my favorite aunt. I won't tell you who was. But my mom was the youngest of 9 children. There were 5 girls. That gives you 4 possibilities for who my favorite aunt was. But my Aunt Mary and I had always had sort of a testy relationship. She was an alcoholic. She acted out a lot. She could be pretty mean. To her credit, she got sober. To her credit, she stopped firing her guns at people. She once made Byron DeLay Beckwith dance in their living room on West George Street by shooting at his feet. And then they had to call in hardwood people to come replace those boards. In any event, he had written to her in his own handwriting in one of his very lengthy letters that he was a man deep in global Klan work, not state, not national, global Klan work, and happy at it. Well, this was the same man who in grand jury testimony had testified under oath that he'd never been a member of the Klan. So they wanted that letter in particular. And the third thing they wanted was a local reporter here named Betty Bean. Who knows Betty Bean? Betty Bean called me while I was working on the book, and she said, there's a guy in Sevierville you need to talk to. Here's his number. Tell him I sent you. The guy's name I had found by holding the redacted files over the Kinko's copier. It's a fellow named Delmar Dennis, who had been a minister and who had also been a Klansman who was an informant for the FBI. He was living in Sevier County, 35 minutes from me. My attempt was to get into my book and on the record Delmar's account, which the FBI files recorded, that said Beckwith had appeared at a 1965 Klan rally taking credit for murdering Medgar Evers and saying the struggle that I went through was no more difficult than what our wives go through to have our children. I did what I had to do. And in another Klan rally, he said it was just like shooting a dog, and what do you do with a mad dog? You kill it. You put it down. Beckwith had a way with words, undoubtedly, and it was his words that came back to bite him in the ass during that third trial. Because in addition to the testimony that I offered, there were witnesses who said he had bragged about the murder, and that sort of sealed his fate. But in an effort on my part to corroborate Delmar Dennis's story, I asked the question nobody had asked him ever, and that was, who was your contact in the FBI that you reported this stuff to? And he said, oh, a guy named Tom Van Riper. Well, Tom Van Riper had been a law enforcement officer and was living 30 minutes away from me in Clinton. So guess how many East Tennessee people were flown under police guard to testify in the third trial?
That'd be great.
3. Me, Delmar Dennis, and Tom Van Riper. And we all gave our testimony. And after 3 decades, at the end of the 1994 trial, Beckwith was convicted of murdering Medgar Evers. And I want to acknowledge that among the uncredited heroes that no one has ever really talked about are those 3 sets of jurors in those 3 murder trials. Because picture what it would have been like in 1964 to have been very well known in Mississippi as having served on that jury. and for being very well known that people held out for a conviction and got a hung jury. Those people were heroes for holding out for a conviction. And I equally call the jurors in the 1994 trial heroes, because it was very unpleasant for them to revisit this part of Mississippi's past and look at this crime under a microscope and in a new light, and finally put away the man who 30 years earlier had committed this murder. 3 good things happened for me as a result of the publication of Portrait of a Racist. The first edition has a subtitle, "The Man Who Killed Medgar Evers," with a question mark. That's because St. Martin's wanted to get the book out so quickly when the trial was underway that we didn't have a verdict. And the general counsel at St. Martin's Press was horrified that if there was a hung jury or an acquittal, we might be lining ourselves up for libel charges. So the question mark on the title in the first edition is a way to hedge the bet. And it's the other thing that's a little bit weird about this book, and which makes it really difficult to read, is that I was required to make so many notations in each chapter so that people could very easily see where I got a piece of information and be able to circle back to that. When the second edition came out in 1997, it had a subtitle, "The Real Life of Byron DeLay Beckwith." And they put a blurb on the cover tying it to the movie Ghosts of Mississippi, which at that time was just coming out. And this edition of the book does have an ending. It came out 3 years after the verdict, and I was able to write about my participation in the trial, Beckwith's guilty conviction, and at that time he was living in jail for the rest of his life. That is where he died. But among the other good things that came out of the publication of Portrait of a Racist, there were 3. My first book, from an unpublished author who was unknown in the book world and had only written magazine pieces, mostly music profiles, got a full-page book review in the New York Times Book Review, which for a first book by anybody anywhere is incredible. The second thing was that there was a review editor at the New York Times Book Review named Carolyn Rand Heron, who called me one day on my landline in Hell's Kitchen, where I was living at the time. After my 3 years here, the book came out, I moved back to New York. And she said, "Would you be interested in doing what we call our beatings, burnings, and bombings segment of the Times Book Review?" Beatings, bombings, and 3. And so for several years, I wrote reviews for the New York Times Book Review about books that were about beatings, burnings, and bombings. And that was a big help to me because although they didn't pay a lot, they did pay. The third thing was that in the summer of 1994, after I'd gone back to do some freelance work for American Express, for whom I was working at the time, my editor at St. Martin's called me at work and said, "St. Martin's is nominating Portrait of a Racist for the Pulitzer for biography," which blew me away. So my boss at the time, Faye Richardson, went and printed out a sign and stuck it on my cubicle that said, "Reed Massengill, Pulitzer nominee," and took me to lunch that day. There are now 3 books about this case. Mine is just one of them. The other 2 are very good and very different. Marianne Vollers, who was a freelance writer for Esquire, did a book called Ghosts of Mississippi, which is what Rob Reiner chose to use as the title for his film. So he paid to use the title, but he didn't use the book, nor did he use my book, although they relied on it. And I even have some cherished emails from James Woods, the actor who played Beckwith in that film, saying that he leaned on much of what he learned from Portrait of a Racist to help determine how high the level of hate should be in his characterization. The other book was by a New York Times reporter named Adam Nossiter, and it is called Of Long Memory. And both of those two books really are more about Mississippi coming to grips with its development and evolution during that 30-year period. I think of them as being as much about the case and as much a social history that puts that case into context. My book is very much a biography of a twisted. He was once called the craziest man ever to stand trial without the benefit of an insanity defense. The new edition, let me show yours. The new edition of Portrait has yet another subtitle. This one is called Byron DeLay Beckwith and the Assassination of Medgar Evers. And the new ending of the book, were any of you at my signing at Union Avenue? I read the afterword to the new book, and what I try to do is tie up the loose ends of this story by making some commentary about how much our world has not changed in 30 years. And I try to put into context all the things that Medgar Evers was fighting for. We're down to 31 seconds. All the things that Medgar Evers was fighting for that in many ways we still have not achieved, and all the things that Beckwith was fighting for in the white supremacy movement that we still see people very actively fighting for. So the new book ends in a bit of a different way. It almost makes me sorry that in the 30 years since this book came out, we have not made more progress. That brings me to the end of my third page of notes. And so very quickly, before I take your questions, I have some questions for you. Who was the first civil rights leader assassinated? Oh, come on now.
Medgar Evers.
Yes, but you already have a book, so somebody else answer. Medgar Evers.
Sorry.
What award recently was Medgar Evers given by President Biden?
The Medal of Freedom.
Somebody who doesn't have this book, say it. Who said it back there?
I heard someone back here.
Wasn't me.
All right. These questions get easier. How many trials were there?
3.
Yes, okay. How many times were Byron DeLay Beckwith and my aunt married?
3.
Yes, okay, you said. Let me just interject, and this is a sad story. The third time he asked her to marry him, he broke her wedding ring finger, ramming her wedding ring on. And I didn't really believe that story. But I was able to get her to sign a document allowing me to request her medical records from Greenwood LaFleur Hospital in Mississippi. And everything she had ever told me about any injury she suffered at his hands, there was a record of. Where is Medgar Evers buried? Yes. How many Sanderson sisters are there? Yes. Finally, How many words are there in pumpkin spice latte? All right, pass this to anybody on this end. Okay, that is the end of my prepared remarks. You have about 15 minutes to ask me any questions you would like to ask, and if you don't mind, I'm going to put a piece of gum in my mouth. Is that okay? Questions? Yes?
You mentioned Tom Van Riper. Was he not the sheriff of Anderson County?
He was the sheriff of Anderson County. Tom was an interesting guy. Tom and Delmar are both dead now. Of the three of us who flew down to testify, I'm the only one left. Tom had been a field agent in the FBI for many years, came back to Tennessee, served as sheriff of Anderson County, retired there, had a lovely little condo townhouse, and was one of the most congenial, talkative guys you'd ever want to meet. And I was struck by his good old boy-ness. And it was that good old boy-ness and his unassuming nature that I think allowed him to be in a position to get these Klan informants to tell him stuff. It served him really, really well. But what uncovering him allowed us to do, and I take credit for this, Delmar had provided the information to the FBI in '55. Tom Van Riper had taken that report down. And so having them in court say, I heard Beckwith say this and I reported it to the FBI, and then having Tom Van Riper get on the stand and corroborate that story was a big deal. Questions? Yes?
Threats to your family when the book came out?
To my knowledge, there were no direct threats to my family. At the time the book came out, I still had a number of aunts and one uncle living. They were really scared for me because they knew the level of crazy that Beckwith represented. They'd been his sister-in-law and brother-in-laws for many years. My publisher, St. Martin's Press, had scheduled a book signing for me in Jackson, Mississippi at a Books-A-Million. And they chose Books-A-Million because it was the biggest local store and had the best place to do a signing. I have the unique distinction of being the Jackson, Mississippi Books-A-Million's only author whose book signings were canceled 3 times in a row due to bomb threats from the Klan.
Another 3.
Finally, I'll get to you in just one second, but finally, under heavy police guard, I was able to do a signing there, at which my cousin, Little Delay, and his son, Little Delay, very creative with the naming in that branch of the family, who had attended the trial and whose faces were known to the cameraman from the local news station who had come to do a 30-second soundbite with me. Cameraman was tying up his equipment and wrapping his cord. We'd finished all that stuff. And I saw him start undoing the cord really quickly. And I looked where he was looking, and here came my cousin, Beckwith's son, striding up the aisle. And so he did a good 2 or 3 minute finger pointing. How dare you come up with this shit and tell this crap and make up lies? And he went on for quite a bit. And I said, DeLay, have you read the book? He said, no, I'm never going to read the book. I'm not going to read the book. And I said, you cannot call me a liar or claim that I'm making stuff up until you've read the book. He said, are you going to give me a book? So I got up, went to the counter, bought a book, and put the receipt in it, and gave it to him and said, read it, and then call me a liar, call me whatever you want to, but read it first. And the receipt is in there if you're so offended by it that you want to bring it back. And he said, are you going to sign it for me? All right, yes, sir, your question.
How did he defend the case?
but he was convicted.
Well, you mean how did he defend it in court?
What defense, yeah.
His defense was that he was not in Jackson, Mississippi, that 2 police officers had seen him at a gas station filling up his little white car with a whip antenna and a Shriner's hang tag on the rear view mirror. And that was his primary defense. Now, that contradicted the fingerprint evidence that was on the murder weapon that they found shoved into a honeysuckle thicket next to the Evers home. It flew in the face of threats that he had made publicly, people who had seen him at an NAACP rally, scoping it out. But his defense was, I wasn't there, basically. Yes?
As a person who now works for the library system, I'm very aware of book challenges, book complaints. I'm wondering if, because of the subject matter of this book, if you are aware of any comments, challenges, complaints that have been issued against your book.
If any of you didn't hear that, the question was, am I aware of any comments or challenges or complaints from the libraries about the book? I'm not aware of any. When the first edition came out, libraries stocked it. The case was very much in the news. There was a lot of press about it. When the second edition came out, the people who bought it probably bought it more because it was tied to Ghost of Mississippi. Ghost of Mississippi. I started to say Mississippi Burning. But to my knowledge, no libraries have pulled it or had a problem with it. It shows up as a biography, which it is, and so that's where you'll find it, in the biography section of the library. More, please. This side of the room, you are horribly underrepresented. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did the 2 policemen show up for the trial?
One policeman was still alive after 1964, and he recounted his exact testimony in almost the exact same words. What they did not know during the first trial was that one of Beckwith's closest friends and fellow Klansmen had a crop dusting plane. And the theory, never proven, is that the policeman could actually have seen Beckwith 90 miles away near the time of the murder, because he might have been flown from Jackson back to Greenwood to establish an alibi. But yes, many of the witnesses who were around during the first trial, one of them was the gun shop owner who had sold Beckwith the scope that he mounted on the .30-06 rifle that had his fingerprint on it. And so some of those people did come back and recount their testimony. Anyone else?
Do you know if the sheriffs were Klansmen?
Well, I do not for a fact have any proof in hand that the sheriff's deputies were Klansmen. So the answer is no. What I suspect and believe, given the tenor in Mississippi and the fact that many people in law enforcement in Mississippi were members of the Klan, leads me to think that there's a strong possibility that they were Klansmen. But no, I have no proof.
May I say one thing?
Sure.
Mr. Beckwith was an entirely different personality than the one he became in his advanced years. He and I were friends. We visited in their home. They visited in our home. Different personality all the way around.
This man poses no threat to me. He is my father. But he is probably the only person here who spent any extensive time with my aunt and uncle when they were married. And Beckwith was a courtly, genteel, obsequious. The level of politeness was so saccharine sweet that it would knock you over. It was so insincere. It was like he was playing a central casting role as a Southern gentleman. Anyone else, or we're going to wrap it up? Yes?
Did you ever have any correspondence with your uncle after he was convicted?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. He wrote me from jail. And I quote pretty heavily in the new ending to the book his reaction to one of the other writers named Adam Nossiter, with a friend of Beckwith's, made it into jail to see Beckwith. And it caused a near explosion of vascularity on Beckwith's part. And so he wrote me a very detailed description of this gentleman who had come into his cell under false pretenses. That is part of the liveliest descriptive material you'll ever see. But yes, he wrote me from jail. My book, I'm certain he read. Nossiter's book, I'm certain he read. Marianne Voller's book, Ghosts of Mississippi, I'm certain he read. He loved anything that had to do with him. And no matter what I said, he thought I was making $1 million writing a book about him. If you want to talk in threes, the 3 years that I left that job in New York, I lost $300,000. And there were months, literally, Dad may not know this, but there were months when I didn't have enough CDs to sell at Disc Exchange to make my $200 rent above Bradley's store, and my mom would slip me $40 to make my rent. The other thing, I want to give credit to the great late Beverly Bradley and Thelma Bradley. Thelma Bradley was a crotchety, skinny little woman who smoked like a chain smoker. But my bedroom above the store was directly above the little island where they served breakfast. And when biscuits were about to come out of the oven at 7 or 7:10 a.m., she would take a broom and hit the ceiling so that I'd hear it and could be down there while the biscuits were hot. So thank you, Thelma Bradley. All right, thank you all for coming. There's one more of these if anybody wants them. This is in no way meant to discourage you from buying the new edition of the book. This is an author's way of saying if you've bought your own book to take to signings and readings and you still have a box or two left, get them gone before you're dead and somebody has to deal with them. So I'll put this down up here.